So one of the pieces written around the same time as the construction of both the Gemeinhaus and my violin was Beethoven's first sonata for violin and piano. that's an example of a piece of music written in the same time as this lovely place was created. Another fun example of music written around the same time would be the music of Paganini. So I've picked out a andante from the most famous caprices, and I'll just play a little bit of that. One thing that's neat to notice about all this music is that the chord progressions have a very popular feel, and I think that'll be especially obvious with the Paganini. Another very cool thing about the Paganini is that it, like the Bach chaconne, which you've already heard this evening, has a descending bass line, and that's a major part of the compositional construction. So we have whereas like the chaconne, you have so you have the D going down to the C sharp, where it turns for a minute, then goes to B flat, skips A, goes to G, then A. The Paganini, we have E, D, C, B, A flat, and finally G. So that is a really fine example of how the music of medieval times, the folk music that came here from Scotland, how all of it has a lot in common. The descending line at one point used to represent one's path to the underworld. But as you notice in music, like the Paganini or in popular tunes that have nearly the same chord progression, for example, G, F sharp, E, E, D, C, back up to D, back up to G. So it's one of the fun things about writing for a string instrument. You can display the bass line quite easily. So when I was thinking about repertoire that could kind of thematically hold together the Gemeinhaus and my 1777 violin, I couldn't ignore fiddle tunes, of course, especially thinking about all the exciting migration of songs and song structures from Scotland. So I discovered that Soldier's Joy is over 200 years old and was first played in Scotland. This is a tune that I'm sure you'll recognize. Another big hit that was written in the 1980s to be reminiscent of these times and Maybe we could play with the idea of it being a 200-year anniversary of Beethoven's first sonata, the Gemeinhaus, My Violin, and Soldier's Joy. That would be the famous tune called Ashokan's Farewell. It's a lovely, beautiful waltz. It was written by J. Unger in an area of New York State that has a large reservoir called Ashokan's Reservoir. It had a music festival, and he wrote it one year at the culmination of the festival to kind of say farewell to the friends and colleagues who had been there. So you might not know it from that historical story, but you perhaps will know it from HBO's Civil War series. Ashokan's Farewell by J. Unger. So another style of music, another function of music at the time, late 1700s, early 1800s, was of course slave songs that later became known as spirituals. One of the early ones was called My Father, How Long? And the reason why this one came to my mind is because the last couple years I've been working on a project with some colleagues in New York that is about Josephine Baker. And during this COVID pandemic time, I actually would have been in Paris for a few weeks giving the Paris premiere of this piece. It's a manifestation of Josephine Baker's identity as a social activist, as a black woman during the time of the Civil Rights era, and it's a sequence of songs. In between each one is a poem by Claudia Rankine. Both Claudia Rankine and the composer of the piece are MacArthur Grant winners, and within the piece is the spiritual or slave song, O Father, How Long? So I'm going to play you a little bit of that. So this is more music that was being sung or being composed around the time of My Violin, 1777, and right here in Bethabara, the Gemeinhaus, 1789. This is My Father, How Long? now that we've traveled to and from Europe for different reasons, from Africa to the eastern seaboard, gonna hop back over to Austria for some Mozart, which was of course written right in the decade of my violin. So I'll just play a little bit of the D major violin concerto. So if there's one thing I'm noticing that you guys are probably noticing too, is that there's an awful lot of fiddle-like playing in these pieces. Everything from the Beethoven to the Mozart. And obviously Soldier's Joy. Couple other fiddle tunes, just to keep everybody in a good spirits. Here's one I learned off of a Doc Watson recording, and as you know, he's not a fiddler, but I learned it first on guitar, and then I translated it to the violin. And like a lot of tunes, I don't know what it's called, but that's just how it goes with the oral traditions. Another fun one from the same time period, also attributed to slave songs. one composer we can't overlook is Johann Friedrich Peter, who I just learned about as I was researching Bethabara and the general time period for music. And as it turns out that Johann Friedrich Peter, who is sometimes referred to as John Frederick Peter, was originally either from the Netherlands or Germany and came over here to be the sort of music director in Pennsylvania. But during the exact decade that I'm looking at today with my violin and the Gemeinhaus, he was here. So I think it was the decade of 1780 to 90. So that sounds like it's right about when the old log house where they did have their sanctuary was transformed into what is now the Gemeinhaus here in this Saal. So it's pretty good chance that in this very Saal you might have heard some music by Johann Friedrich Peter. And although it's I didn't find anything for solo violin, so I'm just going to play you a little bit of one of his string quintets, which it's believed he wrote here in Salem. It's noted as Salem, North Carolina, 1789. So there would have been two violins, two violas, and cello. So you probably heard a little bit of maybe some Mozart influence, maybe some Beethoven, and still we have the fiddling thing with the and some chromaticism. So you have a composer who's writing chamber music in North Carolina in the 1780s. And it's not only great music, it's in the classical style. It sounds like it would be on a concert with Mozart and Beethoven. And also, you know, I'm still learning about this fellow, but it does seem like, from what I'm reading, that he's acknowledged as being one of the first North Americans to write the musical canon that we refer to as chamber music. So it's possible that, you know, here I am getting hired to play this cool gig in Bethabara, and little did I know that the very first noted, you know, I don't want to say the first anything because so many things are reclaimed or boasted to be discovered by or whatever, but what is noted to be one of the first compositions that was considered chamber music was made here in North Carolina the same year as the Gemeinhaus and the same decade as the Gemeinhaus and the same decade as my violin. So obviously he was composing music for the Moravian Church, and he has lots of hymns and choral pieces that are much easier to find on the internet. I couldn't find any music, any sheet music, so I just learned the opening by ear. So here's to Johann Friedrich Peter. I hope that the world gets to learn more about him, and also that would be a great claim to fame for North Carolina. So I also wanted to show you a correlation between the fourth movement of Bach's Partita number 2 in D minor that I played earlier. The fourth movement was a jig, and as we know, a lot of the folk old-time fiddle that North Carolina is so well known for has jigs and reels, contradances, and a whole kind of stuff. So just to show you another little parallel, briefly, the beginning of the jig from Bach was 6, 8. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So I found a old jig that might have been played during this time. It's called Coleraine. This is the F major largo from the C major sonata for solo violin by J.S. Bach. That was the F major largo. And now I'd like to play for you a piece that I wrote. So that does mean it was not written during the era of my violin and the Gemeinhaus, but I think it's always wonderful to include a personalization of all these influences that we have had musically, that I've had in my life, composers who have influenced me, styles of music, regions of the world, cultural traditions. So this is a piece I wrote in 2005. It's called Cave Paintings. I wrote it as I was finishing up graduate school at Juilliard, and as you can imagine at Juilliard, we are more or less on the straight and narrow in terms of honing our craft and really becoming a specialist. And a lot of that includes specific repertoire you play, and there's of course the conservative tradition of classical music. But having grown up in North Carolina and having learned fiddle tunes on the porch with my mom playing mandolin, teaching myself piano and drums and guitar and mandolin, I had a much more eclectic spectrum of the kind of music that influenced me. So by 2005, having been at Juilliard and really just working on my violin craft, I was ready to bring back some of my roots and offer that in my concerts. So I created a short solo piece that is kind of like an encore that you might play at the end of a solo violin recital, which is how I was able to first introduce it. I could get an invitation to be presented in recital somewhere, and then as a bonus, I would include the piece I wrote at the end. Or when I gave my Carnegie Hall debut, I felt it was very important to include a piece I wrote. And at that point, that was in 2006, I was actually ridiculed. It was sort of suggested that, you know, if you must play something you wrote, and like, why do you have to start with it? But for me, it's always been really important to share who I am. And by playing different styles of music, I get to communicate and have a connection with more different kinds of people. So here's Cave Paintings.